Death under the ice. A violent storm, a dying Arctic explorer, and a curious wooden box make Indy the target of fanatical Nazi agents. Inside the box are a slice of Icelandic stone with mythological powers and a journal hinting at the existence of an underground civilization near the top of the world. Indy and Ulla Tournay, a beautiful Danish scientist, set out into the Arctic wastes, racing against Nazi explorers to search for the lost city. Their quest will lead them to a massive cavern beneath the snow. Portal to the legendary Ultima Thule, the key to Hitler's mad plan for world domination. Indy's search for Arctic treasure uncovers the secret of a lost civilization. Indiana Jones and the Hollow Earth.
Hello and welcome back to this downful idealistic crusade. This video is a review of the 11th of the 12 Indiana Jones Bantam novels from the 1990s, which of course is the third by final author Max McCoy, Indiana Jones and the Hollow Earth. This pretty much picks up exactly where his previous book Dinosaur Eggs left off and has many of the same positives, so you will very much feel the tone of the Indiana Jones films. It is approaching the era of the films as this book is set in 1934. So it's basically just before Temple of Doom in terms of the chronology. So this is a very enjoyable read in the various set pieces, and the tone, action, flavor, and especially the humor is pure indie in its spirit. So the McCoy books so far are definitely the ones that most anybody can pick up and read and feel like they're having an indie adventure, much more than the earlier books by Rob McGregor and especially the, I would say, to be avoided Martin Caidin books, which are, of course, terrible, and getting to these McCoy books is really the highlight of reading the Bantam novels after really suffering through those two Caidin books. But they also have some of the same issues as the previous books in terms of you wish the plots were a little bit more cohesive, and some of the books have this unfortunate problem of kind of saving the actual climax and third act for the very end of the book, and so it kind of feels a little bit rushed, and some of those books in the Bantam series can feel a bit episodic getting to that point, and then when you finish the book you kind of wonder why we had to have what seem more like various detours or subplots that don't really go anywhere necessarily. And unfortunately I think you get some of that here in Hollow Earth again. So the issues here in this book are nothing new if you've read the other Bantam novels up to this point, and if you've seen my other videos, this will sound a little bit familiar. It also carries on the strengths and inherent weaknesses of McCoy's previous two books in both Philosopher's Stone and Dinosaur Eggs. We also have some recurring characters. The love interest introduced in Philosopher's Stone of Alicia does actually reappear here, and her story is pretty much concluded. And I suppose the Crystal Skull as a recurring MacGuffin subplot also technically wraps up here. So when you read Philosopher's Stone and then that's a particular artifact of a crystal skull reappears in Dinosaur Eggs, well, it reappears yet again in Hollow Earth. So my suspicion that it was going to be a continuing story point was true, but it seems like both of those elements are resolved here, and they're quite frankly more of an unnecessary subplot that is a bit of a distraction from the main plot. And I think that also means that because we have to keep stopping and focusing on the Crystal Skull, among other things, it does kind of detract from the effectiveness of the main plot. However, again, the great strength of McCoy's indie books and what he has over the other two writers for sure is his ability to really nail the tone of the films, most especially in the humor and the action, which is easily the best action in all of the books. So the various set pieces really stand out, and the best moments of Hollow Earth are the various moments where Indy's in the thick of it and has to figure out a way out of a particular predicament, and does so with his usual by the skin of his teeth and with an occasional joke or groan or something, which feels very Indy. So again, it's the little moments that really work well in McCoy's books. But in Hollow Earth, I think that sort of feeling of the narrative being a bit fractured and episodic is felt most of the three of his that I've read so far. So comparing Philosopher's Stone to then Dinosaur Eggs and then looking at Hollow Earth here, Hollow Earth is the one that, unfortunately, I don't think the plot holds together as much because there's other distractions and it's got much more of an episodic feel to it. However, in the moment, it's extremely effective in those particular sequences. Except in this one, you're going to be scratching your head at points, kind of wondering why we're at certain points. I think there was maybe a little degree of that in the previous two McCoy books, but here in Hollow Earth, there's an entire section of the book that does feel quite unnecessary, actually. Then other elements and sections of the book at first may seem like sort of just a side piece or something, but they're so well drawn and they do technically get us to another point in terms of character development or introducing characters or getting them from point A to point B, and the actual environments and quirky characters and action set pieces are so nicely drawn and textured that those are the most enjoyable parts of the book. So, there is a little bit of trade-off there, but of the three McCoy books so far, I think Hollow Earth is the one where the narrative is the most fractured, and I do think that harms its overall effectiveness, but I think the quality of the writing is improving as well. So, there is a trade-off. It's still a good book. It's an enjoyable book with a lot of good ideas and pure indie in terms of its feeling and the tone and the spirit. I'll also add that I think the inclusion of characters from the films and nods to the films doesn't feel as quite as forced as it did in Philosopher's Stone, which did have moments where it seemed like it was basically trying to imitate moments from the films and also the inclusion of the characters. And I think McCoy got better at that on Dinosaur Eggs, and I think he's even better at it here in Hollow Earth. We get an extended appearance from Belloc once again, except here he's actually in the book for most of the entire section that randomly takes place in New Orleans during Mardi Gras, but that sequence is so fantastic and so wonderfully charming that you wish it was in a film, and it builds to Indiana Jones and Renee Belloc challenging each other to a duel at dawn with pistols, complete with the Danish scholar love interest looking on and being the one counting them off. And gosh, is that not a tantalizing idea? So the entire book is worth it just for that scene alone and how that plays out and how Belloc shows his true colors and stuff. It's kind of ridiculous that they get to that point in terms of the two characters bickering, but it was just such an unexpected surprise, along with the continued really well drawn characterization of Indy, and especially the humor is so winning in this book that it's quite charming, and it's perfectly balanced, and there's a great dynamic between Indy and the love interest this time, even though it doesn't necessarily quite go in a more traditionally romantic direction, because again, Indy's sort of he's still basically hung up on the Alicia character from the previous books. But in terms of the overall plot, the main plot, which keeps unfortunately getting randomly sidetracked by Indy, doing other things because he's actually trying to get the crystal skull to undo the curse he feels he's under, which is why he and the Alicia character broke up in the previous books. But the main plot basically has Indy confronted by a mysterious old man visitor to his house who gives him a mysterious box that he is told to protect and not open, and the old man is revealed to be a famous former Arctic explorer who has been hunted by Nazi agents in the United States, and then unfortunately the old fellow dies quite terribly, and so Indy is now stuck with a box with mysterious artifacts and warnings, and knows that there are Nazi agents after it for whatever reason, and he's also stuck with a corpse. So he's definitely a bit perplexed, because all he was doing was he had prepared to go off on an expedition to do some digging in New Mexico. So Indy now has to deal with this and also make funeral arrangements for the poor old fellow who was from Kansas. So the body has to be shipped back to Kansas according to the will, and Indy has to meet with the surviving heirs and then maybe get to New Mexico for his planned excavations and such. And, maybe he might look into this thing. And he doesn't seem to take much heed in the old man's warnings that there are perhaps Nazi agents after this box and these strange objects, which are revealed to be a bunch of papers and a very strange stone somewhere from the Arctic, most likely. Indy is followed onto his train journey by some of the Nazi agents working undercover, and that train sequence very much has the flavor of From Russia with Love, with Red Grant assuming the guise of Captain Nash and trying to thwart Bond's activities. So Bond fans will obviously recognize that parallel. I think that's what McCoy was going for with that sequence. But as soon as that happens, we have the first major action sequences, and Indy realizes that there's an entire, essentially, secret group of Nazi agents ready to kill him at a moment's notice to recover these artifacts for whatever reasons. And Andy decides to keep going to Kansas and then carries out the funeral, meets with the heirs of the old man, and has further dealings with the Nazis until he is able to finally get away. And then we have what feels like a major detour, because Andy does go to New Mexico, and we spend about 50 some odd pages, I would say, of Indy wandering around in caves and then stumbling onto a secret treasure room, only to barely escape after stealing some gold, which he has taken to ostensibly be able to buy back the crystal skull that he's lost, because that now we're introduced to the sort of secondary plot that will pop up every once in a while, that Andy's still focused on this crystal skull that popped up in the past two books, because he's still really hung up on the Alicia character and very much is still trying to win her back, and thinks that he's under a curse for upsetting and moving the crystal skull. And so that will continually pop up throughout the rest of the book as a story diversion of sorts. But in New Mexico, he runs into the main female character of Ola Tornay, who is a Danish scientist who rather amusingly is very, mostly no nonsense, and has a certain grasp of Western culture, but it's not always correct. And she doesn't believe who Indy is at first, and thinks that he's just some grave robber and obviously not the world famous Indianapolis Jones. So they get off to a really fun start in terms of the relationship dynamic, and essentially they stay sort of joined at the hip throughout the rest of the book and the various legs of the adventure that continues to unfold. But it's kind of awkward how they just sort of meet out in the New Mexico desert, and that's really the only important element of the whole New Mexico section of this book, is that Indy gets some gold to be able to redeem it for the crystal skull, hopefully, and he runs into the love interest of the book. But then we get introduced to more colorful side characters as Indy calls up upon some old buddies who run basically a really crappy and rundown charter airplane service for cargo freight. And this is how Indy cons him into giving them a flight to New Orleans, where Indy winds up being able to meet with Belloc, and of course is paying Belloc off to hopefully get information about the crystal skull. And that's really the whole point of the New Orleans trip. While this is going on, Indy finally decides to follow up a phone call that Marcus Brody has told him about, that the State Department or the Army or military intelligence wants to get in touch with him for some reason. And of course, it is to deal with the situation of a secret group of Nazis running around the country, killing people and trying to kill Indy at all costs, because they are on the hunt for various artifacts, of which one is the artifact and box and papers and elements that Indy has come into possession of. So this is sort of linking into, of course, what we see in Raiders and the certain fascination the Nazis had with certain elements of historical artifacts and the occult sciences. So, it very much is in keeping with the Indiana Jones universe. So basically, Indy finally decides, okay, well, yeah, I guess I can help you guys. And so then we get put on to I mean, really, what is the actual main plot of the book? A good ways into the actual book itself, which is Indy and Ulla being put onto a special team to go into the Arctic to try and discover what is possibly a sort of lost city or something inside the Earth itself, somewhere around the North Pole, that is tied to various legends and various Arctic expeditions who never came back. And the artifacts Indy has are supposedly tied to an idea of a lost city or civilization of advanced technologies who might even have had the ability to provide immortality or invulnerability or great powers that would render all of humanity's weapons useless. So, of course, it makes sense why the German forces would want to obtain an artifact like this. And they're already headed there. So, essentially, Indy gets put onto another mission that requires gathering a team and getting a special plane to fly to remote areas. And you start to think back to immediately the terrible book of Sky Pirates. But thankfully, this is nothing like that. But it's unfortunate that once again, it's like, oh no, it's another plane book. What's going on? But then it becomes a sort of race against time scenario, and we get introduced to a whole crew of new colorful characters on this plane that's a specially modified bomber to have a full equipped team to fly into the Arctic, but it's also sort of viewed as almost a suicide mission or a one-way mission because it's not really going to be possible for people to make it back so easily. And of course, the Germans are in a giant Graf Zeppelin, so once again, we have another Indiana Jones novel with Zeppelin action. So if you were burned by Sky Pirates and you hope that no more Indy books have to deal with aviation or Zeppelins or anything, well, unfortunately, they're here again. But at least here it makes sense, and you don't get 45 pages explaining about how to build an airplane engine or something. But it's unfortunate that this is, again, it's all pushed towards the end of the book, and all of a sudden it's like half to even closer to 3/4 of the way through the book, we're actually kind of technically now put onto the main journey, and we're meeting all the other side characters of this crew. And if that was not sort of confusing and perplexing enough to suddenly be thrust into that, we again have the search for the crystal skull keep popping up because it's sort of in the same area. So Indy is trying to track that as well because it's basically floating around and lost in the ocean. So as they're trying to beat the Nazis to the side and not be spotted by the Zeppelin and sort of remain in a sort of stealth pattern in terms of their flight, they're also constantly checking on this crystal skull. And of course, everybody else on board has no clue what Indy's doing and why he's looking for a particular radio beacon somewhere in the middle of the ocean. Of course, our heroes finally do run into the Zeppelin and things don't go so well. So what has been set up as a sort of race to the North Pole to perhaps find a lost civilization and magical artifacts actually then changes again because Indy, Ulla, and one of the group gets split off. And then it becomes a survival book, an Arctic survival book for the next chunk. And basically our three barely survive, and it's unknown if they will ever meet or run into the other members of the crew ever again, or if they'll even get to the lost civilization, if they'll even survive the next few hours. And this is a well-written section of the book, and it's actually quite investing. And all of these pieces, all of these segments are well written, and the characters are well drawn, and you're invested in them, but you don't exactly know what they're adding up to, and it suddenly feels like we've sort of shifted into a different book yet again. So that flavor of it feeling consistently episodic is here, and this does harm the overall narrative's effectiveness because even when you finish the book, it's hard to think back and remember how we got from the start to the end and what it all meant, because it just seems like there's a bunch of random episodes kind of tucked in throughout and sort of stitched together. Our heroes do eventually make it to their final destination through various means, And of course, the Alicia character has been sort of coerced into working with the Nazis. So she does actually appear at the end of the book, and both her character arc and the sort of secondary plot point of the Crystal Skull MacGuffin that has appeared in these 3 Max McCoy books is tied off. So at least you get that sense of closure with those 2 plot elements. But to be quite frank, it feels unnecessary and sort of shoved into this book because they're not super developed, and it is really, I think, a distraction from the main plot. And if you were to remove those 2 elements, I don't think anybody would really complain, because it would make the story flow quite a bit better. And I think we could then spend more time on developing the Nazi villains a little bit more, maybe having more consistent romantic sparks between Indy and the Ulla character, or at least some more interconnecting bits of plot to make the overall narrative feel a bit more consistent, and maybe cut down on the sort of a side quest to New Mexico earlier in the book. They do make it to the particular section of this sort of undiscovered country in and around the North Pole, which, like the typical sort of flavor you would expect from an indie story, does get into elements of the supernatural or the unexplained, and it doesn't go overboard with it either, which is nice. So while it could be read to perhaps suggest influence or elements of, say, an alien civilization or another life form that had appeared on Earth in years past or centuries past, it's just a hint. So it doesn't go into the territory of, say, the Crystal Skull film, and I think it is very well done. The problem is there's too little of it, and we get some nice action, and we get some nice character moments, and McCoy really does a good job at pushing the overall suspense to the limit. So basically, Indy, Ulla, and the survivors are, they are basically almost at death's door in terms of the suspense throughout the entirety of the climax. And there's a nice sort of a Lost World type feel to the setting they find themselves in, because they essentially go into the Earth itself to a degree, into a sort of underground lost world, which immediately conjures ideas up of Jules Verne or Edgar Rice Burroughs. So, there's a good flavor there. And of course, it immediately makes you think of Rob McGregor's Interior World, but thankfully we don't go into crazy Indy's tripping balls the whole book territory like that book did. So I think the ending here is good, but the problem is it's all at the very end, and it feels quite sudden, and there's not enough time given to, I think, allow the reader to fully digest and recognize all the elements that are going on and think about what Indy is witnessing and things like that. So it's good. It does even have a nice sort of classical death for an Indy villain in a very grotesque way that is very much out of the ordinary. So thankfully we do get that in the McCoy books, because you really don't get that so much in the previous books, in the Bantam novels. But when you finish this book, it just... Of the 3 McCoy books so far, it's the one that you're kind of scratching your head a little bit. It's a good read. It has great moments. It has great humor, and it feels like the films in tone, and the action is first rate. But it doesn't seem to add up to a whole lot, and I think that's because the narrative feels so fractured. Because again, and this is honestly a problem with all the Bantam books, when you finish one of these and you think back to just summarize the plot, you can't really do it with any of them. It's very difficult to summarize all the plot points to remember how we got from A to Z. But here in Hollow Earth, I think of the 3 McCoy books so far, this is the one where that's definitely a factor most. However, on the other side of that argument, I do think it's well written, and I think McCoy is getting better at writing Indy. So honestly, in spite of the issues I have with the narrative feeling a bit fractured, I think this is a better book than Philosopher's Stone, because all the little moments are so well done, It's got plenty of humor that will actually make you laugh, plenty of world building, and honestly, a lot of the smaller sort of sections that seem almost throwaways, like the whole sequence in Kansas, which even has a Indy fighting a Nazi villain barefoot in a projection booth in a movie theater, but that is currently having a dog show in the auditorium. I mean, that just in and of itself it's just a fantastic visual, and that's just in one small scene. Or at the end of that Kansas sequence, Indy manages to or witnesses a bank robbery that breaks out, and he's just like, "Oh, great," and manages to intervene, and you're just like, "I did not know I needed this in an Indy story, but this is great," and it also doesn't take super long like the New Mexico sequence that you kind of wonder why it's there. But even the little bits with all the side characters and quirky characters that McCoy develops, those moments are great. So it's all these little moments I think that are really well drawn, and overall collectively I think they add up to a very pleasurable experience. It's just the overall narrative doesn't have that good sense of cohesion, and it doesn't help that we do have to stop multiple times and focus on the crystal skull popping back up, and we're all wondering, okay, why are we going on about this? This doesn't feel like it fits in this story. But at least this book does wrap up those elements that started in Philosopher's Stone. I don't know. I think I would still probably say Dinosaur Eggs is a better book overall. I do think that book did also have some issues with some of the set pieces feeling a little bit more episodic, but I think because we got on the quest aspect in that book pretty early on, and it remains consistent, I think that's why of the 3 McCoy books so far, I think that one's the most effective. Here, I think you can feel in Hollow Earth that we're obviously not getting to the quest part until significantly later in the book, and there are several points where you're kind of wondering, okay, why are we going off on this side quest? But some of those are ridiculously entertaining and very well done, such as the entire New Orleans sequence with Indy and Belloc, and it ends with them having pistols at dawn. So I mean, there's a lot to love in this book. It's an enjoyable read, but I just wish it had a greater sense of narrative focus, and I wish we got to the main quest more quickly, at least. To talk about the book printing very briefly, this is a later printing that has some of the quirks that I've mentioned on some of the other copies before, but also it's a bit interesting because we, of course, have the beautiful Drew Struzan artwork that makes these so collectible. What they do on the later printings is they usually tweak the actual text of the title. Usually the earlier printings have a more stylized version, and then they also change the little blurb to have more standard-looking text. But they usually also remove the embossed effect on the Indy logo, but this copy actually retains it. So I think it's because this was, not the very last print run, but it's kind of sporadic which books they would do this to. Of course, you have the spine, and then all of these have nice wraparound cover art because Drew Struzan would do an entire painting, always with a brilliant likeness of Ford. But as you can see here, this sort of motif he has on a lot of these covers of having a sort of triangle with other images sort of bursting into the actual artwork, that is maintained here. So we have, of course, another Zeppelin in an Indy book, so it's got to be on the cover. And then the likenesses of Ford are using an classic image from Raiders, and then in the insert, it's one of the classic Last Crusade images. But you always get that nice wraparound effect. And of course, being a later printing, we have the Bantam logo, and then somebody purchased this at Borders back in the day, and I saw this sticker, and I got so excited and sad at the same time because I miss Borders terribly. And of course, RIP Borders, we all loved you. We miss you, Borders. Please come back if at all possible, ever. So I'm never taking that off. I do think, though, in terms of the printing, because this is, credited as a 6th printing, in April 2008, this is a part of the very brief reprints of the Bantam novels that they started doing around the time that Crystal Skull came out. So for a little brief window, most, if not all, of the books got a reprinting or two, and they were actually on the shelf in Borders or Books A Million or Barnes & Noble. And that's why you can occasionally find one of the Indy books in pretty nice shape, but it's going to be most likely one of these later printings from that very limited reprint run. And it's a shame that they only did it for a brief window of time, because then the books went right back to being out of print and being very difficult to track down. So when you're trying to get all the books, you're going to have to track down various copies, and you'll probably be like me, and when you get all of them, it's going to be a mix of the original Bantam Falcon versions and the reprints done around the time of Crystal Skull. And some of them, like this, still retain the nice glossy cover and embossed logo, and they didn't make the art in terms of the text look as generic as some of the others. So some of the reprints did turn out pretty well like this. So those are my thoughts on Indiana Jones and the Hollow Earth, the third of the Max McCoy Indy books and the 11th out of the 12 Bantam novels. I think this is a really enjoyable read. I would recommend all three of the McCoy books I've read so far. And of course, we only have one more to go in the Bantam novels, which is, of course, Secret of the Sphinx, which was the last book McCoy would write. So I can already tell that this book is very high up in my own rankings. I would say of the 11 books I've read so far, this one is definitely up there in the top 3 or 4, I would say, which is pretty much the 3 McCoy books, and then I would say 7 Veils from the Rob McGregor books. So that's sort of where my overall rankings are at this point. It's a sort of loose order. I've enjoyed all the books in terms of the McGregor books, and in spite of their ups and downs, and the McCoy books, especially for really finally getting the film's tone. Of course, the 2 Martin Caidin books are dead last because they're just plain terrible, and of those 2, Sky Pirates is definitely the worst. So those are at the bottom of, I think, anyone's Indiana Jones novel ranking list. But in case you were curious, those will always be at the bottom. But these are fascinating to read, especially for Indy fans who have never gotten around to them before. So I'm very glad that I finally made the efforts to track down all the books and do this reread project. So I have one more video to do to then round off the 12 Bantam novels and then perhaps do a final overall ranking. I would recommend any fan of the films to check out the novels, and even if you're not a fan of the various approaches they take, I think it's a really interesting element of the characters' history in media to study. But if you were just looking for the best books to read that felt like the films, you should definitely start with the Max McCoy books and then decide if you want to try the Rob McGregor ones. And then if you're extremely brave, you could maybe try to slog through the Martin Caidin books, but again, that takes a lot of doing. So as always, I hope my babbles about books, printed media, book series, and our favorite intrepid archaeologist have been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you've read Indiana Jones and the Hollow Earth, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. It's a really fun book. I just wish the overall narrative was more cohesive and we got to the main quest much more quickly. But it's still a really fun book full of moments that will really make you smile and chuckle and get invested in the action sequences, even though it does have some of the same quirks that have affected previous books. For example, the usage of some sort of prologue is here as well at the very beginning, and like some of the books going all the way back to Peril at Delphi, it's actually a flash forward. So here you get a brief page or two prologue at the opening that is from the end of the book, where Indy and characters we don't know at the start of this new adventure are about to literally die because they're at death's door in the big suspenseful moment. So you essentially get that little teaser as a prologue, which I've never been a big fan of prologues like that, but if you were curious if these later books have some of the same touchstones and elements of the earlier books, oh, yes, they do. So even the prologue is still here. But even though this still has some of the various issues and quirks of the previous books, it's still a really enjoyable book, and it's still a book that anyone can pick up and read and get enjoyment out of without having to read the past books. But I would recommend starting with the first McCoy book, Philosopher's Stone, because there is a sort of recurring arc with the love interest of that book and the Crystal Skull, which does go through the first 3 McCoy books and wraps up here in Hollow Earth. So as always, please do keep supporting independent bookstores wherever possible by hopefully being able to find some of these Bantam indie novels, which are unfortunately long out of print and only got that limited reprint in 2007, 2008. So they are rather tricky to track down and can be a little pricey, but if you're patient, you might be able to find some copies in your local used bookstore and help support independent bookstores. And as always, keep reading print books, and thank you ever so much for watching.